Hello, everybody. While you're filing in, I'm Ian Williams, president of the Foreign Press Association of New York for my all too many sins. And so here we are on the wettest of all Mondays. We've had monsoon rains for a week. The rice crop should be good, except there's not many paddy fields from my window in Manhattan. There will be at this rate. And we are talking today about the impending food summit, which is coming to New York, to a UN near you, about the part played by food production and distribution in the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a major UN conference, but there are problems with it. I'm just discussing it with our guest, Marion Nestle, who has written much about this subject. You see on the wall behind her there, her soda politics, about how lots of people who make money out of putting sugar and rotting the teeth of children manage to carry on doing so despite political interference. The divine right to have mega doses of soda in the cinema was far too important to set aside the health of children and the problems of obesity and tooth rot. So, Marion, we are approaching this summit, and it's such a big issue. We are sort of still, those of us old enough remember the Green Revolution, when the third world was supposed to be saved from poverty and starvation because of the application of biologically modified crops and application of fertilizers and so on. So we don't hear much about the Green Revolution now. So is there an anti-green counter-revolution, or has it worked its way out, or is this summit a means of reviving and regenerating that?
Well, you've asked a bunch of questions. I think the Green Revolution is being replaced by the Green New Deal. May it prosper. And the UN Summit is a completely fascinating event that's coming up on September 23rd. It will be in New York. And it's fascinating because to someone like me who's really interested in sustainable agriculture, really concerned about the sustainable development goals of the UN, looking for food system approaches to food problems that will prevent starvation and hunger, that will prevent chronic diseases that are related to diet, and that will prevent climate change and reverse climate change. The UN Summit sounds absolutely fantastic. Its goals are to reduce hunger, to prevent chronic disease, to create equity in the food system, to produce food sustainably. Who could possibly oppose that or argue about it? And yet it has been met with the most astonishing opposition from people who care about these issues more than anything else. And the opposition says this is all fine and dandy, but it's talk, not action. That in fact, the UN Summit has been created by the World Economic Forum, the Gates Foundation, and other representatives of international corporations, that indigenous people, women, youth, minorities, have been excluded from the process of creating the conference agenda, and to the point where they created their own alternative food system summit. There were pre-summits in July. They had their own counter summit. There are plans for counter summits. There are plans for enormous protests. And it's very hard for someone who's not involved in the UN machinations to figure out what's going on with this, because on paper, these things look terrific. And on paper and in statements from officials of the United Nations, they argue that this has been the most inclusive summit preparation that ever existed. Tens of thousands of people literally have been involved in writing position papers, filing comments, creating the agenda. And so it looks like it's this incredibly open process. And yet it created a new word for me, a word that I had never heard of before, multi-stakeholderism. And what multi-stakeholderism refers to is that when you have an opportunity for enormous numbers of stakeholders to participate in a process, some of those stakeholders have more power than others. And it's the lack of equity in power that is corrupting the process and making the UN's process for the summit unfair. And denial of a voice for indigenous people, youth, women, minorities, and so forth. Hard to sort that one out.
One of the point that you're bringing it up in a way about the stakeholders is that the transfer of wealth from normal poor people like us and governments to rich people, no matter how well-meaning, gives them disproportionate. If my government adopts a policy and puts money towards a particular policy, I have some influence over it, no matter how residual. But if Bill Gates has taken the money that would have gone to taxes and he decides to put it through a foundation, he decides the agenda, or they decide the agenda, he and Melinda between them. And they are some of the major stakeholders, I gather, in the new approaches to agriculture in Africa.
And that in the World Economic Forum, which represents corporations more than anything else. It's the purpose, as far as I can tell. I've been to the World Economic Forum a couple of times, and it's very impressive that it exists on several levels. And somebody like me who goes there as a speaker, or someone who's going to be going to committee meetings, doesn't get anywhere near where the decisions are made and where the power really lies. So it's multi-stakeholder. I mean, that's an example of it. It was multi-stake on the two times I went. It was multi-stakeholder in the sense that I was there, but I had no access to real decision-making or to the meetings where the real agenda was taking place.
So what is the real agenda in the connection with the Gates Foundation in Africa, for example?
Well, it's hard to say. The Gates Foundation typically has been very interested in technological solutions to what I think are socioeconomic problems. I think if you have a socioeconomic problem like poverty, it's due to politics, it's pretty hard to find a technological solution to solve that problem. If you've got chronic disease, as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancers, diet-related chronic diseases, as a factor that affects 2 or 3 billion people in the world at the moment, it's hard to think of a technological way to solve that problem. But technological solutions have money behind them, and they make money for the corporations that design those technological solutions. And the problem with eating more healthfully or creating agricultural systems that don't involve expensive fertilizers or pesticides is they don't make money for anybody. There's no economic incentive to push those kinds of solutions, and they lose to the extent that people eat healthfully. Food corporations lose money. I've often, when I'm at my most cynical, I ask the question, who would benefit if people ate more healthfully besides the individuals themselves? What industries would be better off if people ate more healthfully? It's hard to come up with one. It really is very, very difficult to think of a corporate entity that would benefit if people were healthy.
You don't think Whole Foods is big enough to?
No, I don't. I don't. And they sell a lot of junk food.
Yeah, it's fun enough. I've just finished reading something I read 50 years ago, God help us, Sheep Look Up by John Brunner. I recommend it to everybody. It's a dystopian novel that's covered this, and one of the stars of this is a mafia-controlled Whole Foods concern called Pilgrim Foods that sells the same old crap for twice the price and kills people who tell any different.
Yes. Well, one of the things about I don't read dystopian novels. We're living in dystopia. I don't
Exactly.
read a dystopian novel. Oh, I mean, these are very difficult questions, and and it's hard for somebody on the outside like me to see where the corporate interest is in the United Nations agenda. Certainly, the previous head of the Food and Agriculture Organization was towards the end of his governorship of FAO, was very, very interested in sustainable solutions to agricultural problems. This means regenerative, organic agriculture, making sure that anything that you take out of the soil gets replaced, using biological pest control. It has to be smaller scale. It can't be as large scale, and there's no profit in that, except for the benefits go to the producers, the benefits go to climate change, the benefits go to the health of the people who are involved in it, but nobody's making money off of it. And there's big money in agriculture.
Well, we've just seen the end of 20 odd years of Roundup.
Well, we're not done with it yet. We're not done with it yet.
We're not done with it, no.
No.
I mean, it's amazing to watch that go through. But that's a process that illustrates your point. I mean, how many years did it take to get lead out of gasoline? How many years did it take to get asbestos out of building materials? How long did it take to get lead out of paint? And all along, there were corporate interests that fought tooth and nail and ignored all the evidence of brain dead children, terrible pollution everywhere. We have a question here from, I don't know how to pronounce your name, I'm sorry, Lana Wiegand. Have you been involved in the summit or other UN processes? She wanted to know.
Me personally?
Yes.
No, I haven't. I'm a commentator. Oh, I'm a commentator on the outside. And the only thing that I've done is write about it for my blog, foodpolitics.com, where I did a couple of posts, one on the United Nations version of what's going on, and another on the advocates version of what's going on. And I also was a co-signer on a paper in the BMJ arguing for attention during
British Medical Journal. Not everybody knows these reviews.
Well, it's not called the British Medical Journal anymore. It's now called the BMJ.
It is? Oh, God. My age showing.
For some complicated reason, never mind, but it's the BMJ. Actually, it's BMJ Global Health. And I'm a co-signer on an article in that calls for discussion of ultra-processed foods during the United Nations Summit, because the UN Sustainable Development Goals say almost nothing about diet-related chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, et cetera. They say very, very little about that. It's buried in a sub-goal. And there are billions of people, literally billions of people in the world who have these diseases, and governments don't have healthcare systems that can deal with the number of people who have these kinds of chronic diseases. And one of the major factors in weight gain turns out to be what are now called ultra-processed foods. This is a new concept in nutrition that has just become known within the last 5 or 6 years. It was developed by a public health professor at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And by ultra-processed foods, he means foods that are industrially produced, don't resemble the foods in which they come from, can't be made in home kitchens. You can't buy the ingredients for them in supermarkets, and they're junk. They're highly processed junk foods. It's pretty easy to see what they are. They have long lists of ingredients, and these foods, as opposed to other kinds of processed foods, foods that are canned or frozen or whatever kind of processing they go through, have now been associated in literally hundreds of studies with weight gain, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and mortality. There are now several studies that link consumption of ultra-processed foods to overall mortality. And there's one extremely well-controlled clinical trial that was done at the National Institutes of Health on a small group of subjects, but they were in a controlled metabolic ward environment. And when these subjects were fed diets of ultra-processed foods, they ate 500 calories more a day and gained weight, without realizing that they were eating more than they were on matched diets that were not ultra-processed. So there's something about the formulation of ultra-processed foods, we don't know what it is yet, that encourages people to eat more. And so this article that I co-signed with about 10 other people calls on the United Nations to deal with the question of ultra-processed foods as a very important factor in trying to make people healthier. And of course, there's huge corporate interests in ultra-processed foods because that's where the profits are. You don't make a lot of money off fresh fruits and vegetables. You make lots of money off of Doritos or Coke and Pepsi, ultra-processed.
Lana Reichenart, sorry about your name again if I got it wrong, is back again, suggesting that it's interesting, she says, that the summit is advocating agroecology and a shift to healthy diets. So in the face of all this corporate pressure, to what do you attribute the success of getting these things on the agenda and your agenda on the agenda?
Right. What I don't know is whether it's just talk or whether there will be action to back it up. The talk is terrific. I mean, it's really terrific. I read through it. They're interested in exactly the same things that I am. The question is, what is going to come out of it? What kinds of commitments are going to come out of it? What kinds of recommendations will come out of it? And I don't know. I'm not a participant.
Well, one of the reasons it's given this an impetus is, of course, looking out my window now at the rainstorm coming on, the climate change, after years of being off the agenda, suddenly people seem to have noticed that there are more, there's some definite climate change. If your house is burning in California, it's a bit difficult to carry on denying it. If you're in New Orleans and the floods are running ashore and the hurricanes are coming up here on Long Island, then it's a bit difficult to be a denialist indefinitely. But, there does seem to be some consciousness that these are connected, and to what extent is the, how should we say, the more biological, ecologically sound farming practices less carbon less carbon polluting?
Well, there's an enormous effort to try to demonstrate that that's the case. I mean, it seems, there were a couple of reports that came out early in 2019 in The Lancet, another one of those medical journals that I read. But these were two very important reports. One was called the Eat Lancet report, which made dietary recommendations for planetary health and advised that in industrialized countries, people have the amount of meat that they're eating, cut meat consumption in half, and double the proportion of fruits and vegetables in the diet. And the second report, which I think is even more important, had an unfortunate title that I think made it very easy to ignore. It's called the Global Syndemic Report. Syndemic referring to epidemics of hunger, obesity, and climate change that are taking place simultaneously. But the Global Syndemic Report was an analysis from a food system perspective of what the problems are and what needs to be done about them. And in that report's analysis, they pointed out that what stops governments from promoting diets that are lower in meat and higher in fruits and vegetables, which would be healthier for people in the planet, is that governments are weak and captured by corporations. Civil society is weak and disorganized. perhaps as a deliberate result of corporate activity. And climate change is a really big problem in that. And that the food industry and corporations in general are very strong, very well organized, very strong, use their corporate power to influence government, to lobby against things they don't like, and have been very effective in doing that. And so that's an agenda for advocacy. You have three choices: strengthen government, strengthen civil society, and regulate the food industry. And it would be nice if we could do all three of those. And I think to the extent that the Food Systems Summit, which sounds so good on paper, can do that, it will be a great contribution. And to the extent that the advocates who are concerned about the summit not doing that can make their voices heard and can insist that the leaders of the summit take those issues into consideration, that will be a win. It won't win everything, but it'll be a big step forward. So I'm not unhopeful about it. I think the protest about it has gotten the message across loud and clear. The question is what is going to get done about it. And that I have no idea, because I don't know what the summit agenda is. I don't think it's been published yet. It was only announced a week ago that it would take place on September 23rd. That announcement was only made on August 20th.
And well, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but in the face of all of these corporate pressures, what do you think can be done? Because on the one hand, it's very easy to present people as Luddites. So the world cannot be fed with people with digging sticks, planting an occasional yam in the unirrigated land. A degree of technology, industry, commercialization is what's allowed so many people to be fed. Whether that's a good thing or not is something for.
We can argue about. We can argue about that. If people in the United States ate less meat, we wouldn't need as much land for growing corn and soybeans. And let's not forget that 40% of American corn goes for fuel for cars, not food for people. And it's, most of America's food production is not to feed people, it's to feed animals or automobiles. So it's not impossible to think about revising the food system to make it more, to focus it on health and sustainability rather than what it's currently focused on, which is to get maximum profit out of it.
And we're beginning to see the results here, and especially in Britain with Brexit, where the supermarket shelves are all empty. And the industrialized food and production distribution chain is very vulnerable, especially when you throw out the people who used to make it work and send them back to Poland or Romania or to Mexico, as the case may be.
I mostly focus on what's happening in the United States. And I was very impressed at the revelations about the food system that were exposed by COVID-19. When the pandemic hit and our supermarket shelves were cleared out, that was the first time anybody in the United States, except people who study these things, realized that there were two completely different food chains in the United States, one for supermarkets and one for businesses like schools and institutions and prisons and restaurants and places where large numbers of people eat, two completely separate food chains, and that they were not meshable. It wasn't possible to transfer food from one chain to the other because the systems were completely separate. That was a big revelation. The other big revelation—
It's a revelation that might have missed some of the people involved. Can you explain it a bit more?
Well, it's really easy to explain with an example. If you're going to supply if you're going to supply eggs that are going to be used in omelets or whatever to institutions, those eggs are already cracked, mixed, and sent by the tankful. You can't take that tankful to a supermarket and distribute eggs out of it. to individual consumers. I mean, that's kind of a graphic example. So we had shelves that were empty, particularly in the meat sector. And that was because of what happens in meatpacking plants, which almost nobody knew anything about in the United States, except people who've been studying these things, where meat packers were the workers in meat plants who are mostly people of color, very poor, very low income, maybe undocumented, whatever, are working side by side with lots of knives under very difficult conditions. They started getting sick right away. And public health people moved in and said, you got to close these plants. You can't keep this plant open while all these people are getting sick. They're going to go back into the community and infect everybody, which they promptly did. And so when the plants closed, all of a sudden, the growers of the people that were raising beef, raising pigs, raising chickens, had no place for their pigs, chickens to go, and they had to destroy them. This was like the Great Depression of the 1930s. We hadn't seen anything like this since the 1930s, when pigs were killed and caused an absolute crisis in the government over how food was being destroyed, at the same time that we saw people lined up for miles in their cars in front of food banks looking for handouts of food, because they'd lost their jobs and didn't have any money to buy it.
Deja vu all over again, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was astonishing to see this.
Let's get back to, what should the UN be doing differently to ensure that the voices of the less powerful are heard?
Well, they need to have
more inclusive, apart from opening the doors. If the guys with the checkbook still go in the top.
Yeah, I mean, they say they're doing it, and it's very difficult for me to sort out what's really happening. They say they are including youth, women, indigenous people, and minorities, excuse me, at every level of decision making. Is this true? I don't know.
Well, inclusion means we will open, you can send us letters to this address, but we don't have to read them or do anything about them when they arrive.
Yeah, I just don't know. Certainly what they're asking for is a focus on agroecology and regenerative agriculture, a focus on reducing hunger, a focus on inequality and doing something about inequality. These are difficult social problems. Certainly worth the attention of the United Nations. And the food systems is kind of the buzzword for everything that happens to a food between the time it's produced, planted, produced, transported, distributed, sold, purchased, consumed, and wasted. It's the whole cycle and everything that goes into that cycle. So it involves labor relations, it involves the whole systems of health, it involves everything that you could possibly think of that has to do with food and its effects on health and the environment is involved in that. Very, very complex. But anytime you do anything to one part of it, it affects all of the others. So it's great that they're using food systems approaches. And the first thing I want to see in a food system approach is an agricultural system that is aimed at promoting the health of people and the sustainability of the environment. Not one that's aimed at producing as much money as possible for JBS, Tyson's, and other kinds of meat companies. For example.
Well, one of the issues of the summit is, of course, the health and welfare of the producers of the food, because it is a sad fact that throughout the world, that maybe in some areas the farmers and owners of the agricultural producing places are affluent, but in general, people who work on farms that's why they're called peasants. I mean, they're regarded as a lesser breed. They get less money, they get less education, they have less status. what can be done to elevate them? Can we really base a future on a world of affluent, small yeoman farmers?
Well, I think we know that the rewards of economics are distributed inequitably at a level of difference that now exceeds, at least in the United States, it exceeds even the differences in the 1920s. So we went through a period in the United States when the level of inequality wasn't so great. And it's possible to do something about that. The Biden administration, for example, in its anti-hunger efforts, just started giving money to poor people. And you know what? That reduced inequality and solved a lot of the food problems, or the problems of their not being able to buy food. So how rich do people have to be? You know, when I look at Gates, who has more money than I've seen estimates of the number of countries that he has more money than the whole country put together. You know, I mean, how much money can one person use? You can't possibly spend that much. Once you have enough for a decent life, and a life even with luxuries. I mean, I'm not saying that these people shouldn't have money, but that they need that much. And shouldn't some of it come back? And the, you know, it depends on, I guess, how you feel about capitalism and what capitalism is doing, and whether some of the problems that are caused by late stage capitalism really need to be addressed, because when they are addressed, they work.
Well, that's where we came back to before, is that the system since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher embarked us on this, the Ayn Rand road to neoliberalism. We have the position where the money that used to go in taxes to a government to reuse or reinvest on generally socially accepted standards now goes to individuals who can still put that money into, you know, quote, good causes, but they decide what the good causes are.
Right.
You know, if Tesla thinks the good cause is him having a day trip in space, that's the good cause. If Bill Gates thinks that setting up huge agribusinesses across Africa to feed the rest of the world, I mean, that's one of the elements, is that the Chinese are actually buying up large tracts of agricultural land in Africa to ensure themselves feedstock for the future. I'm not quite sure what this does for the Africans there.
Don't think it does much for the Africans. So, you know, if you are concerned that small landholders and small farmers, and most food in the world is still produced by small landholders, you want to help small landholders, you can do that. There are lots of ways of doing that. You know, I mean, there are examples, very successful examples of interventions in small farming where you teach farmers to grow diverse crops, some of which they can sell, some of which are used to feed their family. What you don't want is small farmers growing corn and soybeans to feed animals in the industrialized world, because they're not feeding their families in that way. So, you know, you want small farmers to be able to earn enough money to send their kids to school and improve the educational status of their communities. And to the extent that interventions approach that, they work, but they don't make money for anybody. And we keep coming back to that there's no big incentive to do that kind of work, because it's slow community organizing, it's hard, and it's much easier to try to sell people on the idea that you can grow industrially produced crops that are patented, and you buy them and add inputs of one kind or another, and you'll get a guaranteed crop, but that doesn't feed people.
At the intersection of economics and nutrition, Simon Locke is looking at imitation meat. You know, I'm a born-again carnivore myself, I confess, but replacing a low processed food into a highly processed food. I mean, is
Right.
let's take imitation meat. As far as I'm concerned, you can take it all
Oh, I mean,
away. But I mean, it's
yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. I mean, somebody described it as a boy toy. It's something everybody's involved in fake meat is male, is white male, and heavily involved with venture capital. I'm exaggerating, but that's what it looks like. So this is a technological solution to a problem. There for health reasons, environmental reasons, people in the industrialized world would be better off eating less meat. There's a lot of evidence for that. So but people like eating meat. So if you want people to eat less meat, you can educate them. You can make meat really expensive. You can make it scarcer. Or you could give people alternatives, and vegetarians and vegans have wanted meat alternatives for a long time. I have to say I don't get this very well because I think it's perfectly possible to eat. I'm not a vegetarian myself, but I think it's perfectly possible to eat healthfully and deliciously as a vegetarian or a vegan without having meat. But as one person once explained to me, now that there are plant-based alternatives, she's so happy that she can now take her child to fast food places. So okay, fine. So
how does the math work out? Does a pound of hamburger steak produced, root source of soybeans and beets or whatever, measure up in the carbon dioxide chain with the same coming from a cow?
It depends on who you ask. If you ask meat producers, they say no, although the big meat companies are buying up these plant-based alternatives. If you ask people who are involved in the plant-based alternative community, they have studies that argue that this is going to reduce some of the climate impact. I don't know. These are ultra-processed foods. They're industrially produced. They contain ingredients you can't buy in supermarkets. It's unclear what the nutritional impact will be. The nutritional values are not the same. There are big questions about pea protein. Pea protein is not the same as peas. I don't know. I mean, there's tons of venture capital in this, and how it's going to play out, I don't know. I'm finding it absolutely fascinating to see it. And then we have cell-based meat coming up, which are laboratory based cell culture facilities that are producing, I write about this on my blog too, and I'm astounded at the number of products that are being created: dairy products, meat products, chicken, sausage. They always said you don't want to know how the sausage is made. That may be the case here also. I don't know. It's a fascinating development. Whether it's going to have any effect on meat production is also quite questionable, because while these products have been increasing in consumption, or the plant-based ones, the other ones aren't on the market yet, but the plant-based ones, more and more people are buying them, particularly in the milk aisle, in the dairy aisle. But meat consumption has not gone down in the United States. So they're not really having a noticeable effect, although the meat industry is very worried about them.
I think the New Scientist had an article last week about the plant-based milk products. They can't get it for cheese yet. They've got most of the rest of the dairy spectrum, but they're struggling to make cheese with the
meat products are pretty good in taste and texture. Some of them are better than others, but they're not bad substitutes for meat. The dairy ones are harder. And cheese has been a particular problem, although there are groups that say that they're getting there in cheese.
Well, I'll avoid the counters where they are. I'm sorry, I'm born again carnivore on this one. Lana is asking, what do you think about the coalitions for country action that will be the main outcome of the summit? I presume that, this is a global problem, but it has local application. Solution that's going to work in the Sahel isn't going to work in Scandinavia, and the semi-arid conditions in Mexico can't be replicated in the rainforest areas. So, what's the potential for country action coalitions getting?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but anytime you want to, if you want to oppose corporate power, you have to have power to do that. And the only way to do that is to bring advocacy groups together in coalitions. And to the extent that this kind of thing stimulates coalition building, I'm for it. Coalitions are very difficult. At least I've seen that in the food area in the United States, where there are literally thousands of organizations in the United States that work on food issues. But bringing them together into meaningful coalitions that will work on common goals has been extremely difficult. I think for social reasons, as well as, for one thing, they're all volunteer organizations. They don't have any money behind them. And they all have leaders who, once you establish an organization, then your job is to raise enough money to keep that organization going. Whereas the lobbyists for food corporations are paid to do the kind of lobbying that they do. So the power relations are very difficult, and I'm all for coalition building. The bigger, the better. And if that's a result of this summit, that will be an excellent result.
Is there any quick litmus test for, we're talking about imitation meat, what about imitation NGOs? I came across this 30 years ago at the UN when a global, it was great sounding global climate protection NGO asked for a press conference. And it became apparent halfway through that this was a coal and oil financed lobby, basically against everything to do with climate action. But they covered themselves in green. They put on a green fig leaf and went through on the world brandishing their green credentials. And I'm sure we've seen them with I think there was a coalition for the soft drinks industry, which masqueraded as promoting the rights of people in the ghettos to get cheap soda that people are trying to take from them. I mean, there's always somebody, infinite amount of wisdom and ingenuity goes into presenting bad causes as good ideas.
Yeah, the American Beverage Association, which represents Coke and Pepsi, is very talented at that. And they created a grassroots political organization in every community that was considering soda taxes. And it had some, community named People Against Whatever or People For. And they didn't always acknowledge that it was funded by Coca-Cola. Once somebody started looking at it, then they pretty much had to. But we have a number of, in the food area, there are a number of very well-established organizations that are food industry front groups. The International Life Sciences Institute, which looks on the surface like it's
sounds wonderful,
a food research group, the American Council for Science and Health, even the International Food Information Council. I mean, these are all groups and coalitions that are organized by food companies. They make policy statements on food issues. And if you don't know who they are, you think that they're legitimate community organizations. So, I mean, that's why these watchdogs that are keeping an eye on all of this are doing useful work, if you're paying attention to it. I think for the average person, it's very hard to tell all these groups apart. I can't even remember their names because they all sound the same. They use the same words.
Euphonious. I mean, we've seen that on a broader scale with the vaxxing and the anti-vaxxing. It's amazing how much you can get out there. I mean, even just casting doubt on the issue, like the effect of sugar in soda, can be very effective. You dispute the science. You say, well, that's what they say. but there are others. I mean, you can sound completely spuriously objective about these things, and it's for and against vaccine. Oh, well, there are two sides to this, and you have to consider it. The tobacco lobby pioneered this, of course.
Yeah, that's the playbook. It has a word, the playbook, the tobacco industry playbook. Blame personal responsibility. We don't have anything to do with it. It's up to you. It's your choice. Cast doubt on the science. Buy your own science. I wrote a book about that, Unsavory Truth, about how the food industry influences nutrition research and practice. You recruit your own scientists. And the tobacco industry was terrific at doing that. The chemical industry has been terrific at that. The pharmaceutical drug industry has been terrific at that. And then you lobby behind the scenes. And when that doesn't work, you get legislation passed and you sue, you litigate. That's standard corporate policy. I'm not saying that food is cigarettes. Food is really different than cigarettes. Cigarettes
are— An agriculture organization was actually had subsidies and programs for tobacco farmers at one point. I don't know if they still do.
We have that in the United States too. I think we may be still paying tobacco farmers in some places. Yeah, I mean, and also, the Department of Agriculture is a particularly complex agency with units in it that promote dietary advising for the general public and much larger units that support industrial agriculture. And so sometimes they're working at cross purposes.
Yeah, I'm going back to homeland again. In Britain, the EU paid for all of the farmers to grub up all of the hedgerows that made the English countryside so beautiful, and then discovered, whoops, that means the soil blows away with the next big wind. And the birds and the pollination don't eat the insects anymore. And the insects that used to pollinate the crops can't live anymore because the hedgerows have all been leveled. So, I mean, there's a sort of disastrous track record of industrial intervention in agriculture, government industrial intervention.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a water supply. This may be an exaggeration, but there isn't a water supply in the United States that anywhere near agricultural land that's free of nitrates and other kinds of pollutants. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, the fact that you can't get clean water anywhere in Iowa, the level of pollution of the land. And this has been accepted as an externalized cost of agricultural production because consumers aren't paying for it. Or they're not paying for it directly at the supermarket. They're paying for it indirectly in other ways. If we want an environment that functions better and sequesters carbon better, we have to change our agricultural practices. And where's the profit in that?
Well, the US has been notoriously reluctant to abide by international conventions, except for the ones it's fixed for itself. So what practical effect is the food summit likely to have on US production and consumption of food?
Well, it sets a leadership role. If the United Nations came out and said, we need to do something about agricultural practices to make them healthier and more environmentally friendly, and they did that in a way that was clear and directive and didn't require reading 600 pages of small, incomprehensible print, I think it would have a big effect in setting an agenda for advocates, if nothing else. Then you would have a very clear direction to work toward. In the same way that the UN Sustainable Development Goals were meant to set an agenda for countries, for member countries, in dealing with some of the most serious public health problems and agricultural problems that we have. To the extent that there's clarity and direction, I think it sets a leadership goal. I was very impressed by a paper that was published in the American Journal of Public Health not too long ago on why unrealistic goals in public health are important. Because they set an agenda. They give you something to work toward. They're positive, they're optimistic, and sometimes they actually work.
This is the whole point of the Sustainable Development Goals as well.
That's right.
But I do worry just what you were saying there. I remember the UN Convention on the Trade in Small Arms, which merely asked that manufacturers, countries that produce small arms, register who they sold them to. And do you remember the 10 years of the UN is coming to take away our guns, led by Wayne LaPierre and the National Rifle Association as a result of it? I mean, the UN is a particularly vulnerable target to the sort of aluminium foil capped brigade, the ones who are supporting Trump to a large extent.
Well, all the United Nations can do, it has no power. It has no real power. It can't enforce anything. All it can try to do is to get member nations to agree to common goals. So it plays a very important leadership role. And we don't have that kind of leadership anywhere else at the international level. It seems to me that getting the United Nations to do the right thing is a really worthy goal. Even if it can't do that, if we don't have that, what do we have? And that's all we have. So it seems to me that this summit is very important. I'm retaining some level of optimism that something good will come out of it. And I don't think we're going to know that until we see what happens.
Simon's got the clincher question in the ending. Simon, look, one of the problems for farmers is that most consumers won't pay or can't afford to pay a premium for sustainably produced fruit and vegetables. And that, he suggests, might be necessary to avoid industrialization. Are these mutually incompatible? I thought,
No, I think the question is, what do you subsidize? We subsidize food in the United States, and the cost of producing industrial food is very heavily subsidized. To give just one example, food producers can deduct the cost of marketing to children from their tax returns. That's a business expense. So that the producers of ultra-processed foods who are producing foods that are making people gain weight or encouraging people to gain weight can deduct all the costs of their marketing, all of it, from their income taxes. So in a sense, taxpayers are subsidizing that. The subsidies that we give to corn and soybeans are meant to, and their effect, what they're meant to do is to help corn and soybean producers not go out of business, but their effect is to encourage corn and soybean producers to grow corn and soybeans in places where they shouldn't be grown, particularly corn. And therefore to overproduce. We in the United States produce 4,000 calories a day per capita. That's men, women, little tiny babies. That's twice the amount of food that the United States needs. There's plenty of room to reduce that. If we want the cost of sustainably produced food to be less than the cost of industrially produced foods, we could do that. That's social policy. If you look at what's happened to the price of food since 1980, which is when obesity started in big time, the cost of fresh fruits and vegetables relative to the overall cost of food has gone up greatly. The cost of fresh fruits and vegetables is much higher than the average cost than the average increase in food costs, whereas the cost of ultra-processed foods is much lower. How did that happen? That happened because of federal policies of one kind or another. Those could be changed. That's where the political will comes in.
Well, Marion, I think that's all we've got time for. We're getting towards the end. It's sunny again outside. I've got to go out. But it's This is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association, and we've been talking to Marion Nestle about food issues, which are coming up in the UN summit. And we have interesting future programs coming up. Caitlin, do you have them to show? No, she's gone. We've got Shashi Tharoor coming. Here we are, yes. Blue hydrogen bombs for green energy. I wrote this headline. I should get the stress right. Another issue on this is a pseudo green hydrogen production from natural gas actually produces more CO2 than the original, according to Robert Howarth, who we'll be hearing from soon. We've got Biden, Russia, and China, all bets are off in consultation, in collaboration with the Ambassadorial Roundtable. And we have Tom Osborne speaking about his book on a decade with Peter Jennings. And at some point as well, we've got to get the full details sorted. We have Shashi Tharoor, who is a member of the Lok Sabha, the MP from India, used to be high official in the United Nations, was a candidate, in fact, for the UN Secretary-General, and is a noted novelist and contributed to many newspapers. So he's a colleague as well. These are all coming up. Please join the FPA. Please support the FPA, because we're all running on empty after 2 years of COVID. We're hoping to start things again soon with collaborations and, who knows, live events. But I'm still, by the way, convinced that the epidemic is not over till the fat lady croaks, is the way I look at it. So on that somber note, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much again, Marion. And I hope to see you for a drink again soon.